Good afternoon. A very warm welcome to all, and thank you all for finding time to join the ninth session of our book talks. As a reminder, we have a question and answer session at the end to answer your questions. You can also submit questions in the chat box. Now, without further ado, we will turn the time over to our chief guest today, Vimeesh Maniyur sir. He is an established bilingual poet, novelist, and translator from Kerala. He has three volumes of poetry and a children's novel in his credits. His poems were translated into many of the Indian languages. Also, his English poems were published in foreign magazines. He has bagged for prestigious awards such as Calcutta Malayali Samajam Endorsement, Madras Kerala Samajam Award, and Muttathu Workika Puraskaram, etc. Vimeesh Manu sir is with us to discuss on the poetry collection Love After Babel, written by Chandra Mohan S. Okay, over to you, sir.
Thank you. Am I audible? I hope so. So the text is Love After Babel. Thank you for the invitation and having me on this platform. It's really wonderful to join with students and faculty members in these difficult times. To a great extent, we are stunned by the ambush of COVID-19, but still fighting against the very dynamics of the pandemic. Definitely, it's a difficult time. I'm so happy for this opportunity because it's all about reading and talking about poetry, especially contemporary poetry. Poetry is a way of relief. I strongly believe so. As a reader and as a writer, I always ask myself the question, what is poetry? And what makes something poetic? I know that it's a difficult question. A few days back, I wrote a short introduction to my upcoming collection of poetry and tried to answer this question. Sometimes maybe believe it's a quality of language, it's a quality of vision or perception sometimes. At times I believe poetry exists in and out of language. I strongly believe so. Because sometimes it's difficult to translate certain situations into a language. It's too difficult. And another time, I believe it's all about perspectives providing immense aesthetic pleasure. But still, I don't have any single answer to it because poetry is many things for me. There are many dimensions to it. And actually here I just want to elaborate the political dimension of it, which I think it's very much important. It's all about reading a text. If you look at the contemporary literary scenario, poetry is a serious presence, no doubt. And in a better fashion, it reflects the crisis of the changing times. Whatever be the issue, probably the earliest responses should be in terms of poetry. And I strongly believe it shows the power and popular trust that it carries or that it has, probably. 2 days back, I just want to give an example, a small one. 2 days back, social media celebrated the lines by Vimeesh. Probably all maybe familiar with the lines. This is a kind of reflection. This is a kind of response. And remember, actually this response came as a part of poetry, in terms of poetry, in terms of poetic reflection. Poetry is sometimes a way to express the unexpressed, unmediated sense of life. There are many other versions that we can provide, but for the time being, I think it's a way of telling something unique. Post-millennial Indian poetry, I don't want to call Indian English, it's possible to call, but Indian English, post-millennial Indian English poetry or Indian poetry, more or less, interpreted to the politics of the time, and interestingly carries an element of internal performance. Remember, internal performance, which is, I believe, anti-professional in its core, quite visible in the isolated protest span over the various parts of India. I think it's not possible to call isolated, more or less. The ongoing farmers' protests, for example. And we may have so many examples in and out of the state. And poetry is basically, if you look at it, it's a language of people. Sometimes you may remember the words by Wordsworth, but generally speaking, this is a language, especially if there is a crisis, people speak poetry, I believe so. I will give you an example. If you remember the viral words by the farmer in the Fighting Friends saying that it's not possible to download Rati from any apps, remember. It's a language of poetry. So a usual, an ordinary man speaks poetry. Probably he is not much familiar that he is actually giving voice to poetry. But it's poetry because that's why it became viral, remember. We may have so many gestures in connection with the protests that happened 2 or 3 months away against the Citizenship Amendment Bill. So there are political protests. I believe that these things are part of, if something happens, for example, if you remember the story of Naushad, who helped people. So that became somehow an icon, and this is somehow related with poetry, I believe. It is a language of poetry and also one among the ways of poetry. If any of you listen to the words and tears of Dayabai from the protesting side, it's poetry, nothing else. Again, for example, from a fiction, probably you all remember this one. She lived in the graveyard like a tree. It's nothing but a profound poetical statement on marginalized sections in our society. So probably this particular statement, the first sentence, captures the essence of that particular novel, The Ministry of Utmost Happiness. She lived the graveyard like a tree. So it somehow captures the political position that Arundhati Roy has taken so far. And today our text is Chandra Mohan S. Love After Babel, remember, is an Indian English poet, Indian English Dalit poet, more accurately, is part of P.K. Rossi Foundation, a cultural collective named after the legendary pioneering Dalit actress that seeks to demarginalize Dalit Bahujans. Chandra Mohan's collection, remember, Chandra Mohan's collection, Love After Babel, is a perfect suit for what I intended in terms of poetry and language. Especially for his language is a key word, which is basically a site for resistance. So here I just want to elaborate the idea of politics of his poetry, or poetry as politics. That's what the idea. Let me remind you an interesting quotation on film by Christian Metz. A film is difficult to explain, but it is so easy to understand. And here I just want to twist it. Poetry is difficult to explain. Poetry is difficult to explain because it is so easy to understand. Probably it is all about the sensibility that we all have. We enjoy, for example, the way that we enjoy a dish, the way that we enjoy places, people, talk, for example. So we all have that quality, but still we may have so much of confusion regarding poetry. So here poetry is difficult to explain because it is so easy to understand. Remember that one. Chandra Mohan's poetry is a proven example of it. If you read the poems, I just want to compare. I just want to mention yet another writer, Yogesh Maitre. I don't know whether you're familiar or not, but again, a contemporary writer, somehow connected with the writings of Chandra Mohan S. Yet another Indian English writer, much more clear, I would say, because aesthetically, the beauty of their poetry is intrinsically rested upon the political and linguistic energy that it carries. Remember, that's why. And I just want to start with a few comments on Chandra Mohan's poetry. The first one is actually narrated by Venchi Deniker, professor of history of religions, University of Chicago. I quote, Chandra Mohan's poetry is an extraordinary combination of a strong individual voice, remember. Extraordinary combination of a strong individual voice, crying out against a deeply felt sense of personal abuse, and a sophisticated understanding of the long history and mythology of such abuse, in India especially, but also in the world at large. Poems are shocking, remember. I think these are the keywords you can use. If you want a one-word answer for that, these poems are shocking, moving, and exhilarating. And also, I just want to mention Babida Marina Justin's comment. She says, Chandra Mohan's poems are dialogues of the self with the other. And it is quite interesting, and you can see the dialogue between self with other. He brings to life a world that subverts myths, literary canons, gender, and caste stereotypes by pooling in sparkingly new metaphors with sensitivity and care. So if you look at the list of poems, the first one is 13 Ways of Looking at a Black Bikini. So this is actually, the presentation is somehow, if you want, it's easy to title 13 Ways of Looking at a Text poetry collection. And the first one is, 13 Ways of Looking at a Black Bikini. Bikini, he writes, Bikini is a language, terrifying those ignorant of its text. Probably the first instance of linguistic, I would say a linguistic experience, that poetry, you can sense poetry here. Burkini is a language. It's so simple, terrifying those ignorant of its text. The speaker is trying to politicize a dress which is unique to a section of India and says it's a language. You can see the recurring presence of the word language, articulating the inadequacies of language and need for resistance at the ground level. Divisive politics becomes an undertext of the poem, narrating the structural divide of contemporary India. It's a reality. I think it's better to remember the words by Tagore. In nationalism, Tagore says, the worst form of bondage is a bondage of dejection, which keeps men hopelessly chained in loss of faith in themselves. If you read the text, nationalism, I think it's more contemporary in its tone. And the poet continues, ways of time rarely wash the footprints of a scuffle. Again, these lines are from the same poem titled 13 Ways of Looking at a Black Bikini. If you remember the movie Vizarane, I just want to give an example. It becomes so clear how structural inequality creates deeper divides in consciousness and how critical each and every decision that it take, remember. The next one is the poem titled Before Your Interrogation. Before Your Interrogation is first and foremost a political poem. The whole collection is, I would just want to say that it's too political. And that politics is very much linked with the aesthetics of the text. Politics is not devoid of aesthetics. I don't believe so. Before Your Interrogation is first and foremost a political poem. Here, his language becomes satirical and mocking the entire institutions and establishments, constituting false nationalism for satisfying the social image without looking at the core issues. Tagore says, once again, quoting Tagore, our real problem in India is not political, it is social. It's true that social institutions and structures are the one which constitute rules and regulations for the common man, and making people democratic slaves in certain sense. Reminding you of the words by Henry David Thoreau, saying that resistance is the highest form of patriotism. There are many other similar comments by many others. Even Gandhi himself commented. Chandra Mohan writes, this is probably a humorous line, wear your patriotism on your sleeves like Superman's underwear. Wear your patriotism on your sleeves like Superman's underwear. The poem is Before Your Interrogation. I just want to Gandhi says, for me, patriotism is the same as humanity. I'm patriotic because I'm human and humane. It is not exclusive. I will not hurt England or Germany to serve India. Imperialism has no place in my scheme of life. The law of a patriot is not different from that of the patriarch. And a patriot is so much the less patriot if he is a lukewarm humanitarian. There is no conflict between private and political law. It is actually easy to remember the line person is political too in connection with this context. Chandra Mohan continues, he writes, you need to confess. It's about Before Your Interrogation. You need to confess from the Big Bang to the drifting of Pangea. Again, quoting Tagore, Tagore says, interesting, not against one nation in particular, but against the general idea of all nations. He asked the question, what is a nation? It is an aspect of a whole people as an organized power. So, Chandra Mohan's poetry is a critique of the concept called nationalism in certain fashion, or false nationalism, I just want to say. Casteism is a major thematic concern in Love After Babel, remember. There are many poems about history and politics of caste, such as Nangeli, for example. We are more familiar with the story of Nangeli. Conversations in the local train, for example. The most stunning one is definitely Killing the Shampuga. The title is Killing the Shampuga. Based on the suicide of Rohit Vemula, without ambiguity, the poet speaks out his position and revisiting the intricacies in comparison with the myth of Shampuga. Probably you all know the story of Shampuga, but I just want to touch it. When Rama was ruling Ayodhya, remember, a Brahmin approached the court and told everyone that his young son had died due to the misrule of Rama. Rama immediately called a meeting with all his ministers and inquired about the cause of this. Narada, one of the sages, told him that this has happened due to violation of a rule of penance. Narada informed him that someone from the Shudra Varna who is not allowed to perform penance in this yuga is performing a penance due to which the child has died. So Rama went in search of that person and found the place where Shampuga was performing penance. After confirming that Shampuga is indeed a Shudra, Rama killed him. Remember, Rama killed him. God praised Rama for this act of his and congratulated him for protecting their interests, for not allowing Shudra to attain heaven. Brahmin son returned back to life after it. So this is the gist of the story, remember. So in today's perspective, it is difficult to, what we can say, actually it is difficult to perceive the idea. There are so many problems. There are so many problems. Politics is not acceptable, whether the character is more or less connected with the godly figure Rama. Here the black body, in the poem, the black body, representing educated Varna, swings in mute silence. He's killed by the authority. But in a different sense, it's possible to say that it is a state-sponsored murder. Interestingly, the authority, the extreme right-wing politics always wants to establish a Ramarajya in court. They contradict the very idea that what they have actually preached, remember. There are hundreds of Ramayanas, and here the question comes, which is the one that you are trying to establish? There are different versions of Rama. The same question is reiterated by many others, if you remember the social commentators. There are questions still raising, even if you remember the last incident that happened in Palakkad. There are so many issues. And Chandra Mohan writes, interestingly, Chandra Mohan writes, these are the lines. A black body swinging in mute silence, strange fruit hanging from tridents. The poem is Killing the Shampuga. Ambedkar, there's an interesting comment by Ambedkar on caste. Caste does not bring about division of labor, it brings about division of laborers. As a form of division of labor, the caste system suffers from another serious defect. The division of labor brought about by the caste system is not a division based on choice, remember. Individual sentiment, individual preference has no place in it. It is based on the dogma of predestination. Considerations on social efficiency would compel us to recognize that the greatest evil in the industrial system is not so much poverty and the suffering that it involves as the fact that so many persons have callings which make no appeal to those who are engaged in them. Such callings constantly provoke one to aversion, ill will, and the desire to evade. So think about it. I think you can read this collection and Annihilation of Caste one by one, side by side. And the text becomes somewhat, I think, much more important. I believe love is a political gesture too. Love has many other dimensions too, obviously, I agree with that. But here it becomes a political gesture. So, which is a that aspect is there within the text. Here it is a wonderful poem about love and time, interacting with each other and reaching out for the wisdom essential for the time. The poem is about love, and it's a modification, not a modification. Remember, it's possible to read along with the controversial issue called Kiss of Love. Remember, the poem is in connection with Kiss of Love, and the title is Kiss of Love. The lines are like this: two pairs of lips lock in a kiss. Two pairs of lips lock in a kiss, losing all sense of time. Heads turn to adjust wristwatches from a public cloak. Locked lips turn the wheel of time like prophets. Look at the final three lines. Locked lips turn the wheel of time like prophets. The poem is Kiss of Love. Along with this one, you can also read the poem titled Love in the Time of CCTV. While reading this particular poem, I just remembered the poem titled Love in the Time of Angioplasty by Rash Ravishankar. Love in the Time of CCTV. Actually, the title is owed to a submission called by a literary platform. The title itself is a poetry, no doubt, extending the difficulty of being love in the time of Big Brother surveillance. The poet says, the camera tells us, keep your hands where I can see them. Write your love letter. Once again, the camera tells us, keep your hands where I can see them. Write your love letter. So love is more or less a secret. We all know that. More or less a secret part of life. It's part of our private life sometimes. When it becomes a public affair, turns into a customary act of science, somewhat like that. There is a limit of publicizing the private life of an individual. Privacy, remember, privacy is a value. But in the clutches of the 21st century multimedia surveillance world, love turns to be somewhat like a job, executive job, for example. I just want to quote a few short paragraphs talking about the properties of digital communication and all, digital surveillance and all. It is easy to pinpoint what we mean when we say surveillance. As a first approximation, David Lyon defined surveillance as the focused, systematic, and routine attention to personal details for purposes of influence, management, protection, or direction. This definition tries to convey the way in which surveillance has historically functioned as a necessary aspect of maintaining modern society. For example, in sorting citizens from non-citizens, the sick from the healthy, the credit-worthy from the credit-risk. He then immediately goes on to note that surveillance is often not focused, systematic, or routine at all. For example, in the case of dragnet surveillance that captures information from the digital communication of everyone without any evidence of its efficacy. What actually are we to make of surveillance in a digital age where the capture and processing of personal information by powerful actors is not just routine but ubiquitous? Increasingly, surveillance does not seem as an activity undertaken for simple influence management, protection, or direction, but instead seems to be much more constituting the core security strategy of many nation states and the core business models for the largest internet firms, credit cards, companies, and advertisers. So it's interestingly, what he is trying to say is that digital devices only increase the capacities of surveillance, or sometimes help to foster particular kinds of surveillance, or help to alter its character. So it is an increased sense what happens in the digital age. And there is a continuation of that particular poem. And again, it's a wonderful instance. The Chandra Mohan writes, remember, pure pride march with corpse escorting us on either side, like every alphabet of the poem is being order tested for the scent of the other. So look at the first three lines. Pure pride march with corpse escorting us on either side, like every alphabet of the poem. So think about the image that comes in your mind. What kind of world that we are living in? Somewhat like reading a Kafka or something. Remember, just look at the first three lines. It's unique in its imagery. Chandra Mohan figures out the very dynamic of hierarchy in linguistic expression. This is perfect example of poetic excellence. Love after Babel is propedeutic, a metaphorical introduction. Actually, this comes from Suraj and Day from the introduction, remember? I think it is easy to understand through this comment. It's easy to understand this particular situation more in clarity, I think. A metaphorical introduction to the vast Dalitness that is concerned with the universal totems and humanist good of all. Dalitness is the radical push of Dalits to validate their agenda in the erstwhile ignored spaces. It's a process of reconciliation with ourselves, compassionate, ignorant, and ill-willed. A stitched world of acceptance that has woven together multitudes of identities and their representation in histories. The Debonnaire poet Chandra Mohan connects us to the meeting points of the tender touch and marked the beginning of beautiful human fraternity rooted through the Dalit expression of the world. I think what is the significance, the relevance of this collection? Because it somehow captures the problems of the time, captures the hierarchies, more visible providing more visible examples of the system, the corrupt system or structural inequality. Chandra Mohan writes, in your poems, interestingly, this is a poem titled Nam Dio Dasal's Letter to a Young Poet. He writes, Chandra Mohan writes, in your poems, do not set your rhyme and meter. In your poems, do not set your rhyme and meter to the drum beats of populism, remember. In your poems, do not set your rhyme and meter to the drum beats of populism. So the poem is titled Nam Dio Dasal's Letter to a Young Friend. And interestingly, as I have already mentioned the name Yogesh Maitreya, he translated a poem by this Nam Dio Dasal. And I think this is the right time to suggest this particular poem. The poem is like this. When there is water scarcity, you change cities like you change shirts. When there is water scarcity, you change cities like you change shirts. Those who die without water, what should they change? What should they change? Think about the power, politics. I don't want to use what else. There are many other things. We can write a whole essay on it. We can write a whole book on it. So this is a critique on cultural appropriation. I'm talking about Chandra Mohan's above lines. In your poems, do not set your rhyme and meter to the drum beats of populism. This is a critique on cultural appropriation and an advice to a young poet, saying that your history is different. Obviously, the speaker recognizes that you as an image of self, and in that fashion, he's talking to himself, taking care of the political position that he has to choose in this neoliberal world. This is, in some sense, a declaration. In the introduction, actually, Suraj makes it clear. He writes, non-Western and marginalized identities are a prime target for the new Western that proudly harks on its derogatory ancient values professed through racist appetite and caste blood of affected Dalit. Therefore, giving up one's caste identity, the history of one's belonging is the only way forward for the helpless who seeks to camouflage for self-protection, much to its displeasure. Chandra Mohan brings back the discussion of the black body that is further inferiorized for its naturality. He uses dreadlocks as a metaphor for the physical display of marginalized identity. The damning biometric euthanasia that can even trace your footprint from the sand. Had it been for privacy only, the banks, corporations, feudals, castes, racist, homophobic, transphobic, sexist, everyone would have created a movement to abolish it. Data is a new Orwellian world where the mind of an individual is in the hands of corporate serving states. So it's a wonderful introduction, I would say. Chandra Mohan carries out both linguistic and formal experiments in his book. For example, the beef poem, if you take the beef poem, is an example. Here, beef becomes both a theme and form of poetry in certain fashion. This determines the poetics of the book. He writes, for some poets, beef is the locus of the food for thought in the world, like Buddha's begging bowl. And he continues, a dead cow preserved in formalin, like Hitler's pennies in a museum. Every time the rage attenuates, I beef up. Please listen to this particular phrase. I beef up my poetry. The poem is beef poem. The phrase beef up creates a profound sense of mockery to the discourse on beef politics, and sometimes looking at the whole issue from a distance leads to a certain sense of wisdom. That's what happens in the poem. As I mentioned, mentioned earlier, playfulness is a unique characteristic of this collection. He plays with the words and issues as if he's unaware of the gravity of reality, but obviously that position is visible. Listen, for example, you can also listen to this particular poem. The immigrant experience for a word in a poem is to be accompanied with a footnote. Like the entire poem has a GPS tag on one of its angles. The poet, as like many others, is making use of the contemporary world and establishing new idioms for it. So remember, it's to be accompanied with a footnote, like the entire poem has a GPS tag on one of its angles. Here the poem continues. The immigrant experience for a word in a poem is a solitary confinement in the prison of syntax. The immigrant experience for a word in a poem is an undecipherable tombstone in the war memorial. The poem is the immigrant word. The immigrant word is treated as a migrant worker, It is living the life of a human being and going through the difficulties of time. Is continuously monitored, sometimes confined and neglected as an undecipherable tombstone in the war memorial, somewhat like living in the war memorial. His identity about sex, gender, religion is his display. All are very much connected with his displaced life. Remember, and unfortunately, this is a reality for many of us to a great extent. In the poem, the poet identifies the other. I hope you remember the earlier remarks saying that his poems are the conversation between self and other, actually commented by Justin. More specifically, the self and other are the two sides of the same coin, which is intrinsically linked with the subaltern position. He writes, the poem is the other. In his effervescent smiles, I sense a tinge of alienation. In his adoring synonyms of deification, I deduce the snobbery of denigration. And moving on to the probably one of the major, it's about his position. I think it's a direct expression, declaration of his position. The title of the poem is "Why Do I Write Poetry?" It's the title of the poem. Why do I write poetry? And he says, they ask me, why do you write poems? I write poems. The people have the right to keep and bear arms. Once again, they ask me, why do you write poems? I write poems. The people have the right to keep and bear arms. They asked me what new artillery I had invented. Heckler poems, dynamics at election rallies. Think about think about energy, the political energy of these like Heckler poems. Contemporary poems, generally speaking, don't want to be immortalized. They do often recognize that being an immortal entity is worthless, as against preached by the previous generation of poets. For the new ones, it's a way to survive, remember. For the contemporary poetry, it's a way to survive and to reach at a point. I too am living, to feel that I too am living. They understand that it's a difficult job. Probably you all remember the student who shouted during a speech which was misogynistic, delivered by right now the famous Dr. Rajit Kumar, if you want to know the name. It's now it is an act of resistance. So there are different kinds of resistance, different kinds of expressing that we too have the right to live and we are living. A voice is already heard, which is very much true in the case of Chandra Mohan's poetry. For the past 25 years, the most important resistance movement actually originated among the marginalized sections of society. For example, remembering the Plachimera protest, if you want to remember. It is for the right of living. The basic human right is violated, and there is no platform to mark the discontent and discomfort of living. Some believe poetry is the only way to express this discomfort. Yet another poem. I just want to, I think the time is almost up. I just want to mention one more poem and I can conclude. The title is The Rape and Murder of a Tribal Girl. The rape and murder of a tribal girl is a perfect example of what I said right now. If you just want to know the statistics, India recorded an average of 87 rape cases daily in 2019, 87 rape cases. And overall, of more than 4 lakhs of cases of crime against women during the year, a rise of over 7% from 2018, the latest government data released in 2019, remember. So remember, the country recorded 3 lakh cases in 2018 and more than 4 lakhs in 2019. And what about 2020? That will come probably the next year, remember. So the poem is like this. The poem is like this. Think about the tone of the poem. The rape and murder of a tribal. No newspaper carried a headline or a photo feature. No youth were roused to protest. No city's life came to a standstill. No furor in the parliament. No nation's conscience was haunted. No prime minister addressed a nation. No TV channel discussions. No police officials were transferred or suspended. No candlelight marches. No billion women rising. No a tribal girl was raped and murdered. Think about the language. Think about the roughness of his language. And I think this is the trademark of Chandra Mohan's poetry. I think I just want to talk about the poem Nangeli, but I think the time is almost on the verge of completion. So I just want to conclude saying that there are so many poems, and I just want to say quote one more line. Chandra Mohan writes, "My language is an extinct variety of paddy. It doesn't sprout in the clay used to sculpt my body. I'm a martyr of my language." I think this is enough. and a comment on his poetry by Ananya Wilson Bhattacharya. These poems are unapologetically weapons fighting against the pre-modern notion of caste in all its insidious 21st century glory. Chandra Mohan's position as a Dalit writer illuminates his treatment of caste-based oppression, whilst also creating a sense of radical solidarity between various marginalized identities in contemporary Indian society through his focus on other forms of oppression, namely on experiences of Islamophobia. You can see Islamophobia in the first poem if you want. I think it's probably more clear, visible. The language is extremely powerful and often metaphorical, but it makes no claims to ambiguity. Indeed, this focus on a broad range of experiences, combined with the clear radical politics of many of the poems in the collection, not only singles Chandra Mohan out among young up and coming poets in India, but also creates or locates him within a wide movement of resistance against India's current Hindu right-wing government, one in which new alliances among the oppressed are being forged in order to protest an increasingly fascist regime. So, generally speaking, it's possible to say that it's a site of resistance. It is it's a site of resistance, it's a site of protest. It's a way to say that we too are here, we too are here, we too have the right, we too have voice. This is what makes his poetry, what makes his poems, I think, more reliable. I think that much for right now. Now, if you have any questions, you can ask.
Hello, sir. The session was really good. I just have a general question, sir. At times, I do feel that the modern writers and writers do not express their original feelings. At times, the modern poets and writers hesitate to comment on the existing socio-political situations of the country. But when we look into the olden days in the history of Kerala and everything, we see that the authors and writers gave significant contributions to the society through their writings. It was they who critically commented on the on that existing political conditions, and it was through their writings significant changes that happened in Kerala and many other states. So we have the farmers' agitation and many such problems now, but only a very few authors and writers have come up raising these issues. So how do you comment on this?
Actually, I don't personally believe that there are very little responses from contemporary writers. There are responses, but the problem is it is not highlighted. Remember, there are responses. That's why in the beginning of my talk, I just want to actually send the recent response that actually came from Vimeesh. Actually, the comment actually came from the same day that the result is what we can say revealing to the public. Remember, so if you look at the farmers' agitation, if you look at any of the problems, there are poets and they are writing. There are hundreds of poems about these things. But the point is, it takes time to recognize. It takes time to actually, in a sense, to know about there is a text like that. For example, ജയശീലൻ എന്ന് പറയുന്ന ഒരു വളരെ രസകരമായിട്ടുള്ള മലയാള കവിയുണ്ട്. മലയാള കവി മാത്രമല്ല, അദ്ദേഹം പ്രൊഫസറൊക്കെയാണ്, ഫ്ലൂയിലാണെന്ന് എൻ്റെ ഓർമ്മ. അദ്ദേഹം പറയുന്ന ഒരു രസകരമായ നിരീക്ഷണമുണ്ട് അദ്ദേഹത്തിൻ്റെ ഒരു പുസ്തകത്തിൽ. നിരീക്ഷണം ഇതാണ്: ഒരു പൂവ് നമ്മൾ പറിച്ച് നിലത്ത് വെച്ച് കഴിഞ്ഞാൽ, എവിടെയെങ്കിലും വെച്ച് കഴിഞ്ഞാൽ, ആ പൂവ് തൻ്റെ ശരീരത്തിൽ നിന്ന് വേർപെട്ടു എന്ന് തിരിച്ചറിയാൻ കുറച്ച് സമയം എടുക്കുന്ന ഒരു നിരീക്ഷണം പറയും. Similarly, this is what happens. It takes time to identify, it takes time to appreciate poems. There are poems and there are poets writing, not just writers, not just poets, but writers who are expressing. For example, I have read more than 20 or 30 poems about the contemporary farmers' protest. So it is happening, but the point is that the mainstream media or mainstream magazines and all, they are not actually focusing or actually, in a sense, exhibiting these texts, because they may have their own agenda. For example, they may have their own interests. So automatically, poets or the writers are actually standing in opposition to the problem. because there is a extreme, there is a agenda of extreme right-wing politics is going everywhere. For example, if you remember the issue on the name change in relation with Rajiv Gandhi Center for Biotechnology, so there is a huge lot of problems. Fascism is actually coming near to us, and I think writers and these contemporary writers actually have a clear role to actually protest, to make a block these recent trends. I just want to say. And interestingly, there are comments, there are literary expressions, there are literary auto protests happening, but there is a gap between readers and I think these between readers and magazines, more or less, the media and the readers, more or less, using social media sites and all. Remember, there are so many expressions, so many protest songs. For example, I remember during the time of lockdown, there is one song which is came out penned by Rafiq Ahmad. It's a remarkable. I just want to call it a poem. It's not a song, but there are such expressions all around. But the problem is we have to find out. There is a sense of responsibility inside of readers. I believe so. I hope it's almost clear.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
uh, there is one more thing that I just want to say. For example, I mentioned Yogesh Maitreya, for example, and if you read his poems, for example, there are hundreds of poems that he usually day by day he's writing, he's publishing, posting his poems. And if you remember the one, this is one among them. For centuries, waiting for visa in a queue. Again, he stands in the as a Dalit poet. Remember that too is important. For centuries, waiting for visa in a queue. Ambedkar is the only country I belong to. This is the point. Yes, thank you.
So,
Yes.
Yes.
I just want to know how do you see the last day's incident in Palakkad? The banner which says Jai Sri Ram at the which is hung at the municipality after the victory of BJP. How do you see that in the political scenario of Kerala?
It's a clear example of probably the latest step initiated by fascism. Right now, it's not a fictitious story; it's a reality. And if you look at the scene, if you look at the visuals, when I saw that particular video, I got the picture of that the people, the Sangh Parivar is trying to abolish that what we can say Babri Masjid. It's almost similar to that. So I believe that we all have the responsibility, whether it is poetry, whether it is a talk show, or whether it is something else. We have to actually raise our voice and to say that this is not the fight for that. And if you look at the issue of fascism, for example, when this extreme right-wing politics came into power, the first thing that they have done, if you remember, they had actually created a list to change the names of the existing one. For example, Allahabad to Prayaga, something like that, and Allahabad, Ahmedabad, and Aurangzeb wrote to as Pandit Deen Dayal Upadhyaya wrote, something like that. So they have a clear-cut idea. The fascist government or fascism has a clear-cut idea. They don't have any confusion. We all have confusion. So this is a clear example of a kind of encroachment to the public affair, a kind of, I just want to say that a political encroachment, a socio-political encroachment to the public space of Kerala. And interestingly, the comment is that Palakkad is India's Gujarat, if you remember that comment. So we have to resist. That's what I just want to say. For surviving, we have to resist it.
Thank you, sir.
Okay, it looks like we have covered all the questions. I think we are good for now. So thank you, sir. Thank you, sir, for giving a valuable insight on the topic and gracing this event with your valuable presence. And thank you, everyone. We appreciate all of you being here. Thanks again for joining us today, and we hope to see you all the next time.